Hello, everybody. Yeah, hello. I hope I'm audible to all of you right at the back side. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. A very warm welcome, a very good afternoon to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be once again see such a warm audience and such a warm group of panelists. Obviously, none of them requires much of an introduction, but already the formality has been done. So today we are here to have a very vibrant panel discussion on the perspective of decolonizing the mind. Just to give a very brief background, and I'm sure many of us knows about this whole phrase emerges from a pioneering work of Kenyan novelist, historian, activist, Ngugi wa Thiong'o back in 1986, who was arguing that, you see, the colonization was not just a physical process. It was also an ideological process. It was a psychological process. And it was not just about bodies oppressing bodies. It was also bodies oppressing minds, minds oppressing bodies, and various layers of multiple complexities. So if we have to really indulge ourselves with this whole question of decolonization, it is not just about the physicalities of decolonization. It's necessary that we also look into how we decolonize our minds as well. With respect to that, and especially, we are right now sitting in an era, not just in the context of India, but across the world as well, where the term decolonization, as on the one side, is being very, used on a daily basis, but on the other side, we are also very aware of the fact that often it is used as a problematic metaphor to sort of flesh out communal insularities, to sort of recycle a lot of those colonial ideologies in the name of religious puritanism, in the name of caste puritanism, in the name of class puritanism, and several other aspects. The purpose of saying this is, as on the one side, we need to work on decolonization, on the other side, we shouldn't really compromise with our critical outlook towards this whole phenomenon of decolonization. Having said that, maybe if I can start with you, Shashi, then I move to Carey and then to you, that with respect to your works, like respective works, whatever you have been writing in terms of novels, poetry, and non-fictional works, and also with respect to your geopolitical experiences, what does it mean to decolonize at all in the 21st century?
Okay, well, there's a lot there to unpack, but let me start off by saying that, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who came up with this entire concept, wrote a book called Decolonizing the Mind back in 86, and he was already 48 years old at that time. He had been a serious writer, scholar, academic in the English language. And when he wrote this book, he said essentially that our minds have been colonized to reject our own heritage, that the languages we grew up speaking are not considered the legitimate languages of expression. We have essentially forgotten because the colonialists have imposed upon us a sense of inferiority. And therefore, he said, I'm going to stop writing in English and I'm going to write in my mother tongue, Gikuyu. And thereafter, all his books, and he won the Nobel Prize, if I remember right, were in his own mother tongue. And this assertion of a certain, if you like, a national but nativist sensibility is what became the entire concept of decolonizing the mind. How do you take ownership of your own heritage once again after it has been fractured and distorted by the colonial occupiers? Now, when Shayan asked me about my own works, well, my very first novel is not even 21st century. It's 1989, the great Indian novel. But in that, I very consciously made an attempt to reclaim the narrative which up to that point had been largely written in the English language through the eyes and sensibilities of the colonialists. And so I took the Mahabharata, the great 2,000-year-old Indian epic, as the frame for retelling in a satirical way the story of the freedom struggle in the 20th century up to that present point. And in that process, I wanted to make the point that this period has been talked about by others, but their stories are not mine. And I wanted to reclaim, yes, in the language left behind by the colonialists, a story of India that was my story and not theirs. And in fact, it was a pretty deliberate attempt, which is what led to assorted PhD theses on the postmodernism of the novel, which I won't waste anyone's time on. But even yesterday I met somebody who done a PhD on my fiction, so it's slightly worrying to see that academics have found so much purchase in my books when what I really wanted was for people to read them. But anyway, the explicit thing was made even more explicit by the fact that there are deliberate allusions, even in the names of some of the characters, to others who have tried to interpret our narrative. And the idea was, let us try and take ownership of our own stories, and what are the stories our society used to tell about itself before colonialism came and imposed their stories on our minds. So it was very much a conscious. I hadn't read Ngugi wa Thiong'o, though he had just published his book at that time when I wrote mine, but the fact is the idea was very much one of reclaiming narratives. Now, how long can we go on doing that? And then Shayan's last part of his question made a very important point, which is, can you not see in our country today this argument about reclaiming heritage being twisted to impose a different kind of post-colonial dominance? So if, for example, we now say that secularism was an imported colonial idea, that respect for cosmopolitan global sensibilities is a colonial idea, and that we should be nativist, we should restore our ancient traditions, our ancient sciences, our ancient religions, and so on, and that should be the dominant story of today's India, then it raises a real question as to whether we are not conducting a different exercise of, if not recolonization, at least reconquest of the Indian mind by doing that. So we need to decolonize on the one hand, but we need to find out what was the essential aspects of the Indian mind that are worth preserving. If you look, for example, at Amartya Sen's writings about ancient Indian thought and literature and history and academia, the essays in the Argumentative Indian are a classic example. He would argue that an open sensibility, an openness to ideas from elsewhere, a willingness to engage with them, to absorb them, and to remake them our own, is also intrinsically Indian. And in fact, that you could actually find that what is being asserted today by dominant forces in our politics in the name of decolonization is actually also fundamentally un-Indian. So you can argue this back and forth, and I'm sure in the audience there must be people with different points of view on this. For myself, I would like to lay claim to an Indian cosmopolitanism. An Indianness which is proudly rooted in its own civilization heritage, but which acknowledges a civilization that has been open to multiple influences from around the world over thousands of years, not just centuries, and that as a result has become eclectic, large, agglomerative, and is in a position to actually give something back to the world that has filtered the colonial experience without being recolonized. I'm trying to leave it there because I've taken too long, but that's pretty much my answer to the very complex question that our moderator Shayan began with.
I mean, since Ngugi has been brought up, by virtue of being a Kenyan writer, one of the things he struggled with is like the entire spectre of Ngugi. And at some point last year, I wrote like a profile of him, and in the course of the profile, it's like sort of like asking him about the success of the idea of decolonizing the mind, right? Because one of the things Ngugi did was he stopped writing in English, and so he stopped writing in English both for like his fiction and his non-fiction and his plays. And he would do a thing where he was teaching in Yale, and he speaks English, but he would have a translator in his classes where he speaks in Gikuyu, and then the translator translates in English. And then someone asks a question in English, Ngugi understands English perfectly well, but he waits for the translator to like translate it to him in Gikuyu, and so he can answer it. And he was doing that to prove a point, right? But like, the challenge becomes that even he stopped like doing lectures in Gikuyu, stopped writing essays in Gikuyu, and went back to English. And so like, for the Kenyan writer and like for the African writer, it's like a question that we keep on obsessing over, and it boils down to like writing in English, to say like, Ngugi makes fun of me for having like, my first name is an English name, Carey, and it's like, is that a sign of like me being colonized, right? And like, and I'm very interested in like the ways in like these narratives of sort of colonial narratives end up dominating a country. Like, one of the things about Kenya that people know about Kenya is that Kenya has animals, and that's like it's like, oh, you go to Kenya, it's like safari animals, Lion King, whatever. And like a huge part of this is because in the 1940s, a Danish writer called Karen Blixen wrote a book called Out of Africa, right? And Out of Africa,
movie.
yeah, and Out of Africa was like a bit of a success, but then like the movie became huge. I think it won like 8 Academy Awards, and like Meryl Streep was in it, and Robert Redford, and like this aesthetic of Kenya as like being the safari destination took hold, where like you could like travel to Kenya and like live in a tent in the bush with like the lions near you and the elephants trumpeting and discover yourself, you know, your true self. And to this day, all this persists, and it's like, and and so like a lot of my work like revolves around questions of like how do we fight these narratives, or like how, is it possible to fight these narratives? So you have like people who go to safari, are they perpetuating like a colonial idea of Kenya? Because I also go to safari. I like lions, I like elephants, they're really fun to look at. Am I perpetuating like the colonial idea of like what Kenya is, and like how is it possible to like fight these ideas in the present day?
Hi everyone, I am very honored to be here today and to visit India for the first time. For me, I believe that we need to decolonize the mind now more as never before. Because in the 20th century, for example, colonialism was clear, obvious, and there was a strong fight against it. But now it acts in a very subtle way, and it is deeply rooted in our culture, and it is still with us, and more and stronger than before. My proof for this is what is happening in Gaza now. They kept feeding us that we are one and we are equals, and we live in the era of political correctness, where it's not acceptable to call someone ugly or fat or any other thing. And now we witness them, most of the Western leaders and Israeli leaders describe a whole population as subhuman and human animals, and they get away with it. Okay? So colonialism is still here, and when our minds are colonized, it's the most the most vile way of colonization, because we ourselves act against our cultures, against ourselves. We stop to be aware of ourselves. For me, coloniality is vile because it damages. It's like a psychological damage to our self-image. We ourselves act as if we are not good enough. For me, I witnessed this before. When I was a child, I began reading Russian and Western literature. And we all know that reading is like an enriching activity by nature. But sometimes reading could make our minds colonized. For me, about the first 13 years of my life, I used to think that novels should be set in the West. And the characters should be named David, Oliver, Elizabeth, and so on. Okay? I even tried as a child to write short stories that were set in London and Paris with its characters walking down snowy street. Back then, I have never seen snow before. I have never left my tiny village in the Nile Delta. But I was like an enslaved child. So when I began reading Naguib Mahfouz, the great Egyptian novelist Naguib Mahfouz, and the other writers from the global south, it was like a waking up call for me. I felt, wow, these people are similar to my neighbors, to my family members, and I began to see myself and my own problems and the problems of our societies. So I began after this to immerse myself in reading classical Arabic literature, poems and books that were written like 14 centuries ago. And I think the best way to decolonize our minds is to be deeply rooted in our cultures and to understand our own cultures without being against other cultures. For me, diversity is a spice of life. And it's in favor of us all to have such diverse world with many cultures and but without being enslaved to one culture, without accepting that one culture acts as the culture of power or the language of power. We should resist this and we should embrace our differences and try to reconcile them. So I believe that we need to decolonize our minds now as never before.
Yeah, these are actually like all the three perspectives that have been shared by you all are actually extremely relevant. And when I was listening to all the three of you from your respective experiential and vantage points, I was just wondering about this whole notion of the gaze, right? And as I just started with the introduction that as on the one side, we do talk about a lot of decoloniality and decolonization, but when we try to look for the case of application at the grassroots level, and it's a kind of question that sort of, I believe, I presume, that kind of appeals to all of us. Like, I mean, we read the theories, we read the books, we read the philosophies and all of those dimensions. And especially when we deeply investigate that how colonialism operates, it's not always in an impositional manner. It is often in a very seductive way as well, right? I mean, we are often very conscious that some of the cultural practices are very colonially rooted, but still we want to imbibe those cultural practices just to gain a certain kind of status quo. In certain spaces, it can be a family, a society, a work institution, or whatever it is. Now, in that sense, and that is what sort of brings me to this whole conversation about the notion of colonial gaze. Right? And since all of you are, again, apart from writings, you're also very, in terms of your works, whether you talk about politics or activisms or artworks and whatever, like poetry and writings, whatever you do, your works are also very rooted to the experiences of the society, the daily life experiences. So, like, from your respective experiences, would you like to share some points with us that what are some of the perspectives from where we may start thinking that how do we decolonize? I mean, again, I'm asking this question with this consciousness that we don't have a blueprint for that, and we shouldn't ever have a blueprint for that. But there could be some perspectives, some aspects from where do we start this whole process of decolonization? How do we start?
Well, I must say that for myself, I did not agree with or embrace Ngugi wa Thiong'o's solution because my argument was that English had become an Indian language. And therefore, in writing in English, I was using a language which I had grown up with in India. And for me, there was nothing to apologize for in using that language. I did not feel that using it reflected colonialism. In fact, what I said, the content is what was going to speak for it. In fact, I remember years later, the only time I met Jacques Derrida, we spent a day together at a university in Germany where we'd both been invited. And Derrida said something to me. We had a long conversation. The one sentence that stuck in my mind was, we were speaking in French, and he said, "Je n'ai qu'une langue et ce n'est pas la mienne." I only have one language, and it is not mine. By which he meant French. Because he considers himself of North African descent. He is from Algeria. Yes. But at the same time, for generations, the language he grew up with and speaking at home was French. And he was reflecting on the irony of the fact that his language was not his language. And yet it was a language in which he wrote and created deconstructionism and postmodernism and everything else. To my mind, my response was that I also, I have one language that is better than all the others, and it was also not mine, but I have made it mine. And that, I think, is a valid decolonizing response. You gave us the English language, but we took it from you and we made it ours. And that's something which I would insist upon as an Indian writer in English. But my final point is that I think content is what determines the extent of your the extent to which you're reflecting a colonial sensibility. I mean, what Mansoura quite rightly said, that as young people reading only Western books, you start thinking that that must be the only way to reflect experience. It so happened that when I started writing as a very small asthmatic child, I actually was an addict of Enid Blyton's adventure stories. But my writings were Indianized versions of these stories. It was a bunch of Indian school kids going to an Indian village as my sisters and I were dragged off to our villages by our parents, who were city dwellers going back to the village kind of thing. And so it was an attempt, if you like, a very imitative Enid Blyton type story writing set in an Indian village. So I would argue that too was an act of reconquest of the colonial narrative rather than a succumbing to colonialism. So that's where I would rest my case, but I'm sure others will have their own reflections on this. I have to say, your story about Ngugi, who writes such brilliant English, waiting for someone to translate an English language question to him, was really quite ironic, because in some ways he is denying a reality of his own experience that he has actually mastered the language that he refuses to use. Isn't that an astonishing thing, Carey, when you think about it?
So I don't think that it's that he's denying that he has experience of speaking in English. I think he's trying to like prove a point that it's possible to go to Yale and speak in a native African language, and whatever intellectual disposition is happening will still work. I think that's the point he was trying to prove, that like it's not that I have to come here and always speak in English. Like, I can speak in English if I want to, but I can also like speak to you in Gikuyu and have a translator translate for you, and the messaging will still work. I think that's what he was trying to prove. Yeah, and I guess it's sort of like a thing that like I mean, like a lot of like writers, like we go like back and forth. There are times when like I agree with you that like English is not like a British language. There are times I'm like, no, but am I lying to myself? English is a British language. And like I go back and forth, and it's a continuous struggle. Like it's because of the ways that like these colonial prisms are not only like attractive, but like there's an entire global infrastructure built around them. So for instance, in the former British colonies in Africa, particularly Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, there are a lot of jacaranda trees. And you go to like all the big cities, where it's like Nairobi, Kampala, Durban, Harare, there are like a lot of jacaranda trees. But the jacaranda trees were planted by the British, particularly someone called Jim Jensen, who was a city planner in Durban, and then in Harare, and then in Nairobi. And across all these countries, he came up with like a plan for like, when you plan a city, you always have the jacaranda, right? And so like in Nairobi, jacarandas bloom every November, and they're really beautiful, like purple everywhere. It's like royal color or whatever. And so like every time like we see the jacaranda, it's sort of like, on the one hand, it's like, it's really beautiful. And the other one is like, on the other hand, it's like, by celebrating their beauty, are we celebrating like the weapons of colonization? Should we like cut them down as a way to decolonize? But more seriously than that is there's when Senghor and MSCZ and like all the people were doing like came up with like the idea of negritude, that just because we're black, we're not inferior to like all the white people in Europe. Leopold Sedar Senghor wrote a book. I think he just become president of Senegal, and he wrote like a book called, it's a poetry collection, poems from Black Africa and Malagasy. But in the introduction was written by Sartre. And Sartre sort of like was like, the only way I write this introduction is if you don't read it before it's published. You have to trust that I'm going to do a good job, so like don't read it and ask me to edit it before it's published. So like the first time Senghor reads the introduction is when it's published. And like what Sartre says in the introduction is that like all these ways of decolonizing don't really matter, whether it's negritude or whatever, it doesn't really matter as long as the global economic infrastructure remains capitalism. And in this like infrastructure of capitalism, like black and brown bodies are always at the bottom. So it doesn't matter what you tell yourself about like being equal to like all the Europeans or whatever. His point was that like the only way to like truly fight colonization is by like fighting the structure that underpins it, which is capitalism. And I don't know, maybe that's what I'm trying to say. We should all be communists. I don't know.
I think it's very critical to have critical mind, to read with critical eye, and to question everything. For me, to decolonize the mind is like a lifelong process. I try to work every day, daily on it. I try to question my beliefs and to re-question my writing again and again. For me, I consider myself deeply rooted in my culture, my own culture. As a writer, I try to reconcile all the traditional writing techniques with the postmodern techniques in writing. But at the same time, I am very open to other culture. I am deeply influenced by, for example, by Persian mysticism, by all the Chinese culture, by European cultures. And for me, it is more important to concentrate on what we write, not the language itself we write in. For example, most of the writings and major books against colonialism were written in European languages by writers from the global south. So it's more important to concentrate on the content itself. And for me, I think it is vital to raise the voice against any sort of inequality, injustice, and be always cautious. Because sometimes we find ourselves, we think that we decolonize our mind and everything is okay. And when we act in some way or another, for example, we discover not yet. We need to work more. And for me as a writer, sometimes my way of resistance is to refuse any sort of like be treated as the exotic other as a writer. For example, when I go to take part in festivals and book fairs in the West, I sometimes feel that the mainstream media and mainstream publishing houses expect writers from global south to act, to entertain the Western audience, to confirm the stereotypes about their cultures. My way of resistance is to refuse to do so and to be true to my authentic self, to my authentic culture, without opposing other culture. For me, all human legacy belongs to me, belongs to every one of us, and we should make use of it.
Yes, and I think, I mean, it is again this whole set of conversations that inviting us to reflect on how much important it is to, you know, indulge ourselves into this exercise of self-questioning, even before telling others how I should decolonize or how you should decolonize your mind. It's an important question. How do I decolonize my mind? And I think Mansoura talking about her experiences, and then Shashi and then Carey just sharing about their work experiences is a very important question for all of us to think that the self-reflection and the self-reflection process is actually very unsettling, is actually something very difficult as well, where it is always very difficult to question ourselves. It's so easy to question others. It's so easy to point at others what is going wrong with you. But this whole process of like one of the many exercises of, you know, decolonization could be is to initiate with the process of self-questioning. And with that, I mean, obviously, I am very much like intrigued to ask a few more questions, but also don't want to make like I want to make sure that I'm not just occupying all of the space. So I think it's a wise idea that we open up the whole space for the audience, and let's collectively think, let's collectively reflect. Please feel free to throw your questions, reflections, perspectives, agreements, disagreements, because again, if we are in the decolonizing the mind space, let us not just talk about it, let us also try to put into praxis as much as possible. So now the floor is all yours.
So my question is to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, sir. Sir, in your comic stand-up act, you did refer to the British Museum as Chor Bazaar. Now, this particular trope had been used in social media in order to criticize or undermine anything that the British have to criticize about India, or in the sense that the British, when they assert their national pride, this particular trope had been used to undermine them. So where do you draw the line between decolonizing and in particular an act of jingoism, may I say, like these? So where do you draw the
It's
line?
a very good point, and frankly, I think I've drawn it on a number of occasions. For example, when we talk about reclaiming our heritage, as our present dominant political establishment does, the question immediately follows, who owns that heritage? Don't I own it as much as the BJP elements claim they own it? And therefore, why would I surrender to them a monopoly over their interpretation of the heritage that they want us to go back to? So, in recolonizing, or first of all, in decolonizing, one rejects certain imposed narratives and frames and perspectives. Then, in terms of reclaiming, the question that comes up is, how open are you to different forms of reclaiming this heritage? Now, I'll give you one example. I had written many, many years before my Oxford speech and Era of Darkness and all that, 20 years before that, done a series of columns in my column in the Hindu newspaper about the glories of ancient Indian science that were unknown and underappreciated in India. Now, when Mr. Modi came to power and suddenly the Indian Science Congress became completely dominated by people of that political persuasion, we had some outlandish claims being made that ancient India had invented jet engines and pushpak vimans, and later a chief minister claimed that GPS goes back to the days of the Mahabharata because there was Sanjay far away witnessing the battle of Kurukshetra and talking to Dhritarashtra about it, saying he must have done it because the internet existed. With all sorts of stupid things being claimed. And the jet engines, the pushpak viman and so on. And then the Prime Minister, no less, saying that Lord Ganesha's head on a human body is proof of the existence of plastic surgery. So at that point, I just erupted and said, what you people are doing is you're discrediting the real achievements of ancient Indian science. It is actually historically established that plastic surgery, the first known instance in the world of plastic surgery, is in India. Shushruta conducted a rhinoplasty 2,000 years ago, and his procedures, a record of it, and his instruments have been found by archaeologists. So there is no dispute. But when you come up with this absurd thing, anyone thinking for 2 seconds will realize that the smallest imaginable elephant head cannot fit on the largest imaginable human neck. So using that as an example of plastic surgery discredits the real claims of plastic. And I then saw various critics laughing at the idea that ancient India had plastic surgery. We did, but not because of this example. So similarly, we have had great scientific accomplishments, but not the ones these idiots are claiming. And my point is, you are discrediting what I value in my heritage by making spurious claims about our heritage. You see what I mean? So that is a way in which you can draw that distinction. Yes, the British Museum is a chor bazaar. They have purloined, looted, stolen items from every country they conquered. From Egypt to Africa to India. And there is no denying that because the evidence is there. Ask them to put narratives at every one of the things saying where they got it from and how. Now, slowly some things are being restituted. The Benin bronzes have been given back to West African civilization. The Rosetta Stone has gone back to Egypt. We haven't got anything back. Neither the Amrapali stupa, nor the Kohinoor diamond, nor Tipu Sultan's sword and lion, nothing. The fact is the Brits, when asked and confronted directly about this, have said, well, if we give you something back, we'll have to give to every other country in the world and there'll be nothing left in the British Museum. So, we'll look after it well for humanity. That's their excuse. But let's call theft what it is. When you pay an admission fee to go to a museum in Britain, you are essentially paying today's Britons so that you can see what their grandfather stole from your grandfather. That's basically what that's all about. And there is no harm in pointing that out, whether or not it leads to any concrete outcome. But that doesn't mean that every single thing in British civilization came from you. Give them credit for what is theirs, blame them for what they took. But let us also at the same time accept that many things they did were of value to us. Let's face it, a lot of the discovery of many ancient texts and many ancient ruins were actually done by intrepid British explorers within India and within Africa. And for us to now say that, because we had allowed them to be lost, we would have discovered them sometime, maybe, maybe not. What has happened cannot be, you cannot make it unhappen. So let us look at the picture whole. Let us lay claim to what we can of our own heritage legitimately. And let us accept that there are others who want to interpret that heritage differently. There is no one truth when it comes to reclaiming as part of decolonization, the narratives of your past. You may have some knowledge, I may have some knowledge, he may have some knowledge, and nobody has a monopoly of the complete truth, in my view, at least as far as India is concerned. There's a hand up here, whoever's got the mic. Yeah.
So don't you think we are like trying to hide one extreme with another? Like we can't deny that we are learning English or it is part of our culture, and trying to deny that we are not learning and it is someone else's doesn't mean that we are not learning it. So in every school we are learning English. It is our language. It is kind of our language. We are speaking it. We are using it. Isn't it better to direct our attention to something like reclaiming our culture?
Yeah, I mean, we can reclaim our culture in any language. Look, to begin with, here are 4 people, 3 of whom have different nationalities. I mean, Shayan and I are Indian. He is, you're a Kenyan passport holder, or and you're an Egyptian passport. So we're looking at 3 different nationalities. And the reason we're able to have this conversation is because we all have enough English to communicate with each other. And so why should we reject that, right? We are able to do that. Similarly, if you go to our own culture here in Kerala, there is an Ngugi wa Thiong'o story in the story of O.V. Vijayan. Right until class 3 or 4, I think until the age of 9 or 10, he studied everything in the English medium. And then suddenly he decided, this is not right, I must know my own mother tongue. And he made a conscious effort. In fact, he was one Malayali novelist, perhaps the only one, you could argue, whose English was as good as his Malayalam and his Malayalam was as good as his English. But he wrote his novels in Malayalam. And he vetted the translations of them. In some cases, he translated them himself into English. So he wasn't denying English, but he felt it was important for him to tell these stories in Malayalam. And I fully respect that. I'm not saying I disrespect Ngugi's choice or Vijayan's choice. These are great writers, great contributors to human civilization who took a particular stand. But for myself, I say, well, the English had no desire to impart their language to the whole of India. They wanted to teach a very small, narrow stratum of people who would be complicit in the colonization of India, who would serve them as minor clerks and minor people. It was actually Indians who said, as long as English is ruling this country, let's seize it. So for every university or college established by the English, there were 9 or 10 established by Indians. You must remember this. It was Indians who said, we need English and we will teach it to ourselves. And then Indians took ideas they acquired through the English language and transmuted them into ideas that rejected colonialism and rejected what the British were doing to us. What did Frantz Fanon do? He's considered the great theorist of anti-colonial theory. He wrote in French. That was the language in which his mind had been educated and trained. But he used that mind so that, as I keep saying, the content matters to me much more than the medium. But my 2 friends should be allowed to express their views on this too.
I mean, it's like a similar thing in Kenya where there were all these schools established by the British, like also like train a very narrow subset of people who would like be clerks, obviously. But then there were also all these African independent schools led by like people who are like, it's the same reasoning of the British are here, the British have like defeated us in battle and like now ruling our country. The only way for us to defeat them is to learn their methods. So we're going to send all our children to school so that they can learn their methods, and then they can use those same methods to fight for our own independence. And it's like, yeah, as long as you're using, it's possible to use that language as a way to fight against the people who impose the language in the country.
Exactly.
This discussion reminded me of some Algerian writers. During the liberation war against France, a lot of famous and very well Algerian writers wrote in French, and they consider this like their way of fighting the empire, the French Empire. For example, Malik Haddad and Katib Yassin, and they wrote very exceptional novels against the French occupation and about their native country and about their own narrative of what is happening. I think if they would have written these novels in Arabic, I think it wouldn't have had this influence. And also, I remember another modern Algerian writer. His name is Kamal Dawood. He wrote a novel like against the stranger of Albert Camus. Albert Camus, the stranger, didn't name any Algerian characters. All the named the characters that are main characters and have names are French. And he sort of silenced the Algerian and Arab voice. So Kamal Dawood wrote a novel about the victim, the life of the man who was killed in The Stranger. And he wrote it in French. I think if it was written in Arabic, maybe no one would have heard about it. Sometimes we have to use this language. As I said before, the content is what matters. What we write, what we embrace as writers, what we put between the lines is what matters.
Agree entirely.
Hi everyone. My question is also to Mr. Shashi Tharoor. See, Sion has actually again focused upon the fact of questioning oneself, self-questioning to further go into decolonizing. So I want to come to my level where a man in the 20s growing up in India. Okay, when we start working in a multinational company, say an American company, one of the first things that our managers or supervisors, whoever it is, tells us is not to call him or her by sir or madam. Call me by my name. Okay, that is a question of individuality. But then when it comes to our society, when we, for example, I called you Mr. Shashi Tharoor, that might have disgruntled some people, at least some people who are sitting here, because you are considered to be some kind of a respectful personality who should be called sir. One thing is that, the question of individuality. Second thing is, see, during the COVID era, all this Black Lives Matter movement was going on in the television. Watching that, I am seeing an American population who is fighting, a black population who is fighting for equality, okay, against the whites. Okay, they are calling for equal rights. And when I'm looking into Indian culture, we are seeing our ethnic people trying to become fair, that is trying to become white by putting makeup. And this fair culture is so prominent in even in our cinematic Hollywood, or what kind of industry it is. So this is a question of individuality, where we have to question ourselves what our individuality is and embrace ourselves within that. Is this because of this democratic maturity that America has achieved over the centuries of democratic growth they have achieved, and we are only 70 years into, or 75 years into independence? Does this play a part in this questioning ourselves regarding our individuality with regard to decolonizing the mind?
Interesting question, because I would say that, by the way, it's not just America, it's Europe as well, Western Europe anyway. Because when I joined the United Nations, I was all of 22, and I was shocked when my boss, who was about 30 years older, told me to call him by his first name. And even more shocked when a senior Indian official, also in his 50s, told me to call him by his first name, which in India I could never have imagined doing, right? And then after an international career of almost 3 decades, I come back to India. And as you know, I fought election, became an MP, became a minister, and I just couldn't get people to stop calling me sir. I said, you don't need to call me sir, stop it. And then, even to this day, in my own team, here in Thiruvananthapuram, I can't get my team to not only not call me sir, they even always refer to me with a sir attached. I think there's something deeply hierarchical in our culture that we just can't shake off. That's Indian. It's not particularly colonized or otherwise. I think we have this thing that, we call people Airten or Annan or Chetan or, we have this thing for elder people. And that's why when we speak in English, we call older people auntie and uncle, which in the West would be horrifying to them. Don't call me auntie. My sister lives in California. She's here somewhere in this festival. And she goes around saying, don't call me auntie. I'm not your auntie. But the fact is that in India, it would be assumed to be disrespectful not to do that. Now, what do we do about this? I honestly think it has nothing to do with colonization. It has to do with acculturation. We have been culturally trained to show respect to the elders in such a way that we are conscious that when we don't, it is automatically assumed to be disrespect, even if no disrespect is intended. So Shayan asked me before this session, what can I call you? And I said, you can call me Shashi, no problem. But had he not asked me, he probably would not have taken the risk of using my name in front of a whole bunch of people without feeling that he would be accused by them of disrespecting me. Because that's our culture.
Hi, sir. Myself, Parvati. Sir, mostly what we discussed here, everything was connected to a linguistic level. So, is decolonizing the mind only connected to a linguistic level, or are there multiple aspects to it? Because I teach English and I learned English for my post-graduation. So, I have this doubt whether everything is connected to this linguistic level, or how or where we start decolonizing our mind in other aspects.
No, I mean, yeah, I think you should answer.
No, before you answer, you will answer. It's like interesting that you just said the whole spiel about Sir, and she asked the question and said, Sir, I have a question. It's very interesting.
Right. But anyway, I mean, I think both Shayan and I started with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, whose entire book called Decolonizing the Mind was predicated on language as an instrument of colonization. And as I said, in his own life thereafter, he only wrote in Kikuyu and not in English. But the argument that he was making is what then became, the phrase decolonizing the mind is the title of his book. But in the last almost 40 years since he published that book, people have obviously expanded the notion of decolonization. So remember that in the same period, that is in the years from, let's say, 1945 when the United Nations was founded to when he wrote his book, there actually was a whole decolonization narrative which involved getting imperial powers and colonial powers out of the countries that they had conquered, giving political self-determination and independence to those countries, and allowing those countries to reclaim their heritage in their own way. And so decolonization as an idea is much more than what this particular concept of decolonizing the mind means. Having said which, when you're talking about heritage, language is obviously one of the elements of heritage. Dress is another. Cuisine is a third. Art forms, dance forms, a fourth. Literature, a fifth. So there are so many different ways in which you're saying the colonialists completely messed up my culture and I want to claim it back. I mean, this is why, for example, in the 20th century, the revival of Bharatnatyam was actually encouraged by the independence movement. You understand? Because we are not going to be colonized by you to understand that only Oscar Wilde plays and ballet and so on are the acme of culture and civilization. We have our own, and we're going to do that. That sort of thing. The revival of classical Indian music, which had never died out, but was not given any official encouragement by the colonial power. You can imagine for 200 years, in no grand national setting, was any classical Indian music, any classical Indian dance form ever given an opportunity. So when we won independence, it became very important to start showcasing those as part of decolonization, reclaiming our narrative. So it's not that it's only language. Language is one thing, but there are many, many other things that we want to reassert. And that is where the political danger lies. We are talking about reclaiming our heritage. Some people are saying, we know what is the right heritage. This is the heritage, and this is what we should reclaim. And if you don't agree with us, you're anti-national. You're anti-Hindu. You're anti-Indian. That is a very worrying political distortion of the entire colonization, decolonization narrative. Do you have anything similar in Egypt, this kind of debate?
Yeah, I agree with you that the colonizing the mind is much more complicated than language. It's like more cultural and social structure. It's deeply rooted in the way we view ourselves and we view the world around us. For example, for me, it's more vital to examine and question my own culture as well, my own heritage. I talked about questioning everything and having critical eye. When I try to apply this to my own heritage, for example, our oral heritage, the Egyptian folkloric tales have fantastic aspects, of course. There are a lot of females who might find themselves in a very difficult situation, but they manage to rescue themselves through intelligence and wit and cunning without depending on any male. This is, I didn't found this in the fairy tales in Europe. Okay? This is something I'm proud of. But at the same time, we have many dark aspects concerning discrimination between men and women and so on. And I can't embrace patriarchy, for example. I should resist it as well. So I think it's all about how to question everything and how to work daily. Because we writers, we always be immersing ourselves in thinking and examining everything around us and be open to everything we come across, and also try to find how to be inspired by it. For me, it's not like a practical thing.
But Mansoura, isn't there sometimes an issue that when you reclaim your heritage, you may be reclaiming practices that are oppressive to sections of your society? In all of North Africa's Islamic societies, you've got this whole debate about female genital mutilation, where people, it was banned under colonial rule, but once the colonists left, it was resurrected as a practice, and then women from these societies started raising concerns that this was against them.
Yeah. Of course, this is what
so you can debate your heritage.
Of course, this is what I am saying. What I am saying, I embrace the positive things, but I resist anything that is against women, is with patriarchy, and so we should be critical all the time. We should question ourselves as well, as I mentioned before, because I don't like to be against, for example, colonialism, so I'll be like following blindly or embracing something that I don't accept in my culture. This is what I say. I think it's most important for a writer to be like an outsider. He or she must be deeply rooted in his own culture, but should defend his position as an outsider to have like a clear vision of his society and other societies as well.
Yeah, and like both of what you're saying, like, yeah, it gives a person a lot to think about. And I'm just thinking about, so around 13 years ago, the current president of Kenya was tried at the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, mass murder, mass rape, and like a whole litany of things. And what happened is that like immediately the cases were brought before the ICC. He and the other accused made the argument that the ICC is an imperial court that only ever tries people from Africa and people from Asia and doesn't try Westerners. And so like, why should we as, in this case you're saying, why should we as Africans accept the rulings of this court which hasn't tried, say, the Americans for like what was happening in Iraq or whatever, or has never tried any Westerner? Why should we accede to like this court? And they went on like a lobbying offensive across the African Union, and they got the African Union to agree with the argument that like the ICC is an imperial court that only goes after Africans, and so whatever he was accused of the case should not proceed, right? And so what happened is that like the case was dropped, partly because of like this argument that is framed in like very in a decolonizing way, also like partly because like a lot of the witnesses ended up dying mysteriously, as happens, right? So 12 years later, an African country is now at a different court at The Hague, ICJ, South Africa, arguing that like Israel, which for all intents and purposes is a Western country, should be tried for committing war crimes in Gaza. And so what I've been wondering about is that like if there's any connection between like the move the African Union made in 2011 that ended up like legitimizing like the courts in The Hague in the eyes of a lot of like people from the global south, and now like 13 years later, is there going to be like any any possibility for like the ICJ, whatever decision they make, actually like getting favor in these countries? You know, what do you think? I mean, especially given your history, what do you think?
No, I mean, the notion of universalism, whether it's in international law, as you mentioned, the International Court, Criminal Court, or even the very concept of human rights, is one of those hotly disputed issues, especially by those who claim that it's an imposed colonial narrative. I happen to believe there are some universal values. I don't believe there is any mother who wants to see her son imprisoned or tortured or murdered. There's no human being who would cheerfully relinquish the right to life. The question is, where do you get agreement at the end of the day on what is truly universal and what is culturally specific? I do believe that life, some liberty, freedom to be yourself and to explore yourself, the freedom to defend your rights and promote your rights, all those are universal values. And if indeed those are grossly violated, and the countries that are violating them are unable to bring justice to their own people, there is a moral argument for an international tribunal. That's as far as most people will agree. Then the terms of the tribunal, what laws will be implemented, who will prosecute, what will be done, all of that becomes disputed, and that's where we have some real disputes, as you rightly pointed out. I'm not disagreeing with that. But the fact that arguments and disagreements exist doesn't mean that there is no merit to this side of the equation as well. And I think part of decolonizing our minds is in deciding for ourselves what it is that we will value of what came with the colonialists, or what we learned through the colonialists. Maybe it pre-existed them, but we didn't have it when the colonialists came. And what we wish consciously to reject as inapplicable to us. And that will vary from country to country, culture to culture, preserve some basic universal norms, and on the rest, look at them with a critical eye. That's where I would leave myself.
I think, actually, I know there are a lot of questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So we have to sort of, let's not use the word conclude. Let's say that we kind of take a pause, and I'm sure we will find more spaces of in continuity with each other. And just a final round of, words to share. At least after all of these conversations, I believe it's been very heavy, it's been very complex, and also very interesting and moving for all of us. But also what I always embrace, and like in an appreciative way I say through my work, is we are all pushed into a state of messiness. And let us embrace this messiness with a lot of happiness. We don't have to create borders. We don't have to shut ourselves within compartments. Let's be in that state of fluidity and porosity with each other, where we don't really have to agree with each other, but let's be critical. Let's be, sort of reflective of what we think, of what we do. So with this, I think we just come to a final end, and we will surely continue with this conversation sometimes later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, sirs. And I also take this opportunity to thank all of you for taking part in the session. With that, we have come to the end of the session. We will be beginning our next session soon. Thank you all.